Hi, and welcome to this live reading from The Singer and Her Song, Empire at Twilight, Book 2 by N.L. Holmes, and this is presented by Itsy Bitsy Book Bits. Chapter 1. What distinguished evening from day was the silence Icnudum realized as she stirred the watery soup that was meant for dinner. Only as the sun sank, listless, into twilight did the constant accompaniment of the daytime hours cease. The dull, rhythmic boom of the Assyrian battering ram as it swung again and again against the gate of the city. The noise itself had become a weapon, as relentless as the wind or the killing sun of summer in the desert to the southwest. How did they keep it up, hour after hour, day after day? How many men were swinging that ram under the cover of its wood and leather horse? Day after day, on and on, they swung it, while the defenders hurled burning torches down onto the contraption in vain. The real question for the people of the little Mitnanian city of Kahat was how long they could hold out against their besiegers, and in her heart of hearts, Icnudum, daughter of Tepshihuni, knew the answer. Not very long. She would never say it out loud. Everyone was too close to despair, her family, her neighbors, and maybe even the priests who ruled the city and directed its defense. But nobody held out against the Assyrians forever. For nearly 2 months the siege had dragged on, longer than you dogs expected, she thought defiantly, and food was dangerously low. They'd been penned inside for before the wheat could be sown. All they'd had for weeks was a little porridge stirred up from the tiny daily allotment, a little dried fruit, the few sheep or goats within the city walls shared out among the inhabitants, then the final bits of dried meat from last winter's slaughter of pigs, then the dogs. Now they were finishing the stored grain from the temple granaries. She didn't know what would come next. Icnudum refused to eat a rat. So far she had kept her family fed. Little Wooloo, her youngest son, was delicate despite his thick, stocky build. He wouldn't eat just anything. Her daughter, Tatashi, had the needs of the pregnant. Icnudum had stretched their sparse rations with wild dandelions, roots that grew between the stones, and a few straggly lettuces already bolted and bitter from the spring garden behind the house. She'd brought her portable brazier inside so she wouldn't have to cook outdoors in the evening chill, and she could keep better watch over Wooloo asleep, exhausted in his little alcove. They would simply have to live with the smoke. Crouched over the embers, she stirred a thin soup made with wild greens and a bone she had bartered from the neighbors. She didn't want to know what kind of animal it had come from. An onion would have been worth the king's ransom in Kahat. The fact they'd been the honored musicians of the temple of Tesub and Shuruma wouldn't do them much good anymore. No one, not even the gods, had time for elaborate services and long hymns and incense and magnificent sacrifices these days. And what would they sacrifice? Everything edible had been consumed by the gods' starving people. Even the priests were manning the walls, organizing the making of torches and filling jars of their dwindling water, ready to pour on any fire the Assyrians might lob into the city. She hadn't practiced her vocalizing for weeks. Who had energy for singing after a long day of hauling rocks? With a shuffle of footsteps at the door and the scrape of the wooden bar rising outside on its lever and string, her husband, Ardashub, entered, throwing down his borrowed pickaxe on the floor with a thunk. He was white with dust, face, hair, and clothing all the same color as if he had been hewn from the stone of the walls. A man of stone. Icnudum rose, creaking, to greet him and exchanged a kiss, her spoon dripping in her hand. Arteshub heaved an enormous sigh of exhaustion and forced a weary smile as he sank down into the floor mat. He arched his back painfully, leaning against the wall. His dust-stiffened hair stood out around his head like gorse. Icnudum remembered how Arteshub's beauty had struck her when he first came to her father's house. She'd been, 14? And Arteshub, 9 years older, no longer a child. He'd already proven himself a better lyre-player than her father. "Good evening, my dear," Arteshub said. "It smells good in here." "Better than it tastes, I dare say. How goes the work on the counter wall?" Like every able-bodied man in the city, Arteshib had been reinforcing the weakening gate, piling stones against the inside of the panels so that when the Assyrians broke through, they would encounter yet another impassable obstacle if the inhabitants didn't starve first. The women, Ichneudum and her daughter included, had spent the day carrying stones from the site of destruction to the slowly rising counterwall. I was tearing down houses today. He examined his blistered palms and held them up for her to see. Ichneudum could scarcely imagine Arteshib swinging a pickaxe, but then many things had happened over the last few weeks that she could never have imagined. We can't seem to round up enough stones. Ichneudum ladled out a bowl of this pathetic soup. It won't fill you much, she warned her husband, then called out in a louder voice. Tatashi, Shala, come and eat. You never know when it will be your last chance. Tatashi entered from the courtyard where she'd been trying to wash clothes with the same jar of water they'd used for weeks. She unrolled her sleeves to conceal the red, raw-looking skin of her forearms. Is that water going to get the clothes cleaner or dirtier? I don't know, Nira, but they said the wells were low. We need to save every drop for drinking. No chance of going down to the river to do the wash, that's for sure. If it doesn't rain soon to fill up the cisterns, I can't imagine what we'll do. Anyway, this will get out the sweat, if not the stains. I hope you and Atani don't mind sleeping in your tunics tonight. I've washed our nightgowns. The young woman looked down at her father, who smiled at her in return, although his eyebrows were anxious. Her face, tired and dispirited, broke into a sweet smile. Atani, welcome home. How's the work going? She took the bowl of soup from her mother and sank to the floor beside him, drawing the low table closer. She nudged her father's shoulder with her own in an affectionate gesture. She's still Papa's girl, Ichneudum thought with a twinge of envy. They've always been so much alike. Ichneudum brought her own bowl and settled herself painfully across from her husband. Squatting to pick up rocks the whole day long had put her cranky knee into a bad mood, and the brazier had finished her off. She finished a small pot of water and a towel to Arteshib's so she could at least wash his hands. The towel was black and stained with blood from the raw fingers that had been wiped upon it, the water none too clean. It, too, had been reused frequently. More of the same, Arteshib sighed, and blew on his soup. His dark lashes were as dust-whitened as the rest of him and gave his black eyes a curiously innocent appearance, like the painted round eyes of a doll. We could have rebuilt the temple with all these stones, yet the pile still doesn't seem to cover the backside of the gate. I think a 5-year-old could climb right over it. Well, don't be so negative, Ichneudum said. They haven't broken through yet. By the time they do, you'll have covered the space, and the Hittites may still be coming to our aid. Have they said anything, the priests? He shook his head, his face suddenly shuddered. The Hittites are coming, Ichneudum snorted. How long have we been telling ourselves that? Our allies are sometimes suzerains, the sworn enemies of Assyria. Of course they're coming, but they never seem to get here, do they? No doubt, if they're in Mitanni at all, they're trying to relieve the capital. If Tate fell, Mitanni was no more. The old capital had belonged to the Assyrians for a century. The little bit of the kingdom they called Henangalbat was all that was left, and nobody but the Mitannians cared. Ichneudum found she was more cynical than she wanted to advertise. If you ask me, this whole rebellion was an absurdity. Tatashi wasn't normally one to weigh in on politics, but like every inhabitant of Kahad, she had a vital reason to be concerned. Her gentle voice was bitter. They've left us all alone all this time. Why rock the boat? It's we on the borders who are paying. A little town like Kahad, what can we do? The king wants to look strong, and the rest of us pay. So would you just let them pick us apart? Ichneudum asked. Of course he had to rebel. We should be part of Hadi, but those Assyrians think we still owe them something. They'll just take and take until somebody says no to them. Arteshib raised his eyebrows in a considering gesture, but his pursed mouth was unconvinced. Ichneudum plowed on. I think King Shatura did the right thing. At least if we go down with some pride. I've already lost my husband in this war for somebody else's pride. Have you forgotten? Tatashi set her empty bowl down on the table with a clatter, surged to her feet, and fled the room close to tears. Nunum exhaled an exasperated breath through her nostrils, but she rued her harsh words. Tatashi was a soft soul who tended to mix with her own emotions into pragmatic things like politics. And she was pregnant. A woman often was on the edge of tears at such a moment, especially when she confronted the reality of bearing a child without a father to protect it. Gods grant that she could even bring the little one to term. It would be her last chance to give Inamati the heir she had never managed to produce before. How terribly sad that Tatashi should find herself expecting during this siege. Well, she was only 27. She could always remarry if she survived, if any of them survived, and if any men were left after all this. Little Wooloo, what would happen to him? The sudden image of the Assyrians batting down Wooloo's stumpy body and riding over him leapt before her eyes. Gods forbid, over my dead body. Artesha was watching her wearily, his face strained, the pouches under his eyes crusted with dust and more visible than usual. He had finished his soup and was rubbing his knuckles. She locked glances with him. Sweet Shiruma, look at what those dogs have done to your servant, she thought, caught between sorrow and outrage. Her husband was one of the great lyre players of the age, and his fingers were swollen and abraded from handling stones, his nails ripped off to the quick. He couldn't pluck a string if he had to. This cries out for justice, Lord. Punish those barbarians who have no respect for your temple. Her anger spilled over, and she said more harshly than she intended. Don't leave any food. We hardly have anything left, so you'd better eat it while there is some. Artesha tipped up his bowl to show her it was empty. Thank you, Ashti. I know you're tired too, yet you and Tatashi always manage to put together something to feed us. Has Wooloo eaten? He has. He's gone to bed. Neither of them spoke for a moment. Then Artesha's voice dropped, pleading. Uknudum, my dear, don't be too hard on Tatashi. She's had a terrible shock, seeing an Amati killed right before her eyes. She's had to bear an extraordinary amount of suffering through all this. Tatashi's handsome young husband had been the first casualty of the siege, shot through the throat with an arrow while everyone stood around below the walls, handing up weapons, proud and triumphant. And Anami Mahdi had stood up on the ramparts, all red-faced and laughing and full of a young man's bravado, and cupped his hands to shout an insult. And then his head snapped back, and he'd plummeted like a stone into the crowd. What were the chances? She could hear the Assyrians cheering and laughing below the walls, the pigs, while Tatashi froze as if she were the one struck mortally, and began to whimper. No, 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 no. The only consolation had been the discovery soon after that she was pregnant. Now Ignudum had wondered if even that had become a punishment. One more thing she had to fear losing. At least back then they'd been able to bury their dead decently. These days there was no time for anything but a common grave. I know, my love, but life has to go on. She's not the only one who's lost her man. If everybody just threw up his hands and said, this costs too much, we might as well open the gates and welcome the damned curs in. He smiled vaguely at his lap and murmured, You might be right, my love. Which meant he thought she was not right. She felt a flare of resentment at Artesha, who never came out and said he disagreed, even when he did. She'd berated him about it. Are you ashamed of your position? Then defend it, man. Show some spirit. He was a soft soul like his daughter, always evading confrontation, always making accommodations, never taking a stand. Perhaps that was another lesson learned from Tupshuni. The master had brutalized him, yelled at him, and made him do passages over and over, once actually knocking the lyre from his hand in public. He'd criticized the youth's table manners, his choice of clothes, and even his mountain accent. And Artesha had never fought back. But she reminded herself he was the love of my life. She'd been swept away by his beauty, his liquid black eyes, the sensitive face, and those hands which seemed to have a life of their own. And seeing him here, a weary, half-starved, graying man who could be a grandfather with his beautiful musician's hands tattered and raw, the enormity of their situation overwhelmed her. She leaned over to kiss the bare crown of his head and sighed. What's going to happen to us? There was a moment of grim silence, then Artesheb, his face suddenly stiff, opened his mouth to reply. He spoke as if he wished he might not speak, the words struggling through his lips in reluctant pieces. There was a rider who got into the city just at sundown in Icnudum. They let him into the postern gate. He was coming from Tate. What news from the capital? Have the Hittites come? Yes, they were there. But, Icnudum, my love, Tate has fallen. Icnudum froze, an icy breath of fear raising the hairs on her neck. This was the end of them. I didn't want to say it in front of Tatashi after I saw how upset she was. King Shatura has fled nowhere. No one is sure where. The Hittites have withdrawn in defeat. It's over. Icnudum closed her eyes to gather her strength. Tate had fallen, just as Washukani had fallen 2 generations before. Both capitals were gone. Mitanni was no longer a nation, not even Heningalbat, the nostalgic pretense of a nation, but instead just a few rebellious cities. The Hittites had come and nothing had changed. Mitanni was defeated, they who 200 years before had been an empire to rival Great Misery. Once Mitanni had conquered Assyria, something that latter had never forgiven. Kahat was alone now, and the wolves howled at the gate. There would be no relief to look forward to. There would be no rescue. There would be no hope. It was well and truly over. Icnudum drew a deep, unsteady breath and forced herself to speak in a conversational tone. Do you think the priests will surrender now, or will they continue to resist? I think they'll resist on the off chance that the Assyrians lose interest and lift the siege. That was the word today among the men. Even if they surrender after having held out for so long, we'll be punished, so why not? Hope and fight on. Despite these words, Artesheb's face was without hope. They'll burn us down as they have every other city that's resisted. A bonfire of anger roared to life within Icnudum, as fierce as any city torched by the Assyrians. Who are these people anyway? What gives them the right to swallow up our country? She closed her eyes and spoke solemnly, fists clenched, her voice quavering with fury. May the gods smite those bloodthirsty bastards. May they smash them on the rocks. May they drown them in the river. May... Icnudum, my love. Artesheb held out his arms to his wife, and she crawled around the table to him, nestling against him, her hands against his bony chest. Whatever happens, he murmured into her ear, know that I have loved you and the children. The day you married me was the happiest day of my life. I have always admired you as a singer, but more than that as a woman. You are my only love, my dearest. She heard his voice break, felt his tears on her neck, and she longed to feel the same urgent loyalty. They'd been married for 28 years. She had borne him 4 children, and she too could say that the day she was married to him had been the happiest of her life. But what exactly did that mean about the rest of her days? She loved him passionately once, had wanted nothing but him, and had braved her father's wrath for him. And that was all that need be said. She loved him too, though can I say he was my only love? Icnudum felt a pulse of guilt somewhere below her heart. Now it might well be that their lives were ending. One of them might have to go on without the other. She knew Artesheb couldn't survive her death. He'd grown around her like a tree around a fence post, and to cut out the post would leave the tree fatally maimed. On the other hand, she could survive his death. If 48 years of life had taught her one thing, it was never to rely too much on anyone else. When they come, Artesheb no longer said if, but when. Be sure to tell them you're a musician, Icnudum. I've heard their king spares musicians, drafts them into his own service. Make sure Tatashi does too. And little Wulu? Well, he's our child. They won't separate him from us, will they? I don't think it will matter that he isn't a musician himself. You're expecting humanity from those people? She snorted bitterly. Gods protect us all. She drew away from Artesheb and levered herself up. I'll collect the dishes. Tatashi may or may not snap out of her snit. Don't be too hard on her, Ashti. We never know which day will be our last together. Don't be so damned sentimental, Arteshib. We need to think in practical terms. Should we try to get away before the city falls? Others have left. But we don't know if they were captured or not. Well, we're certainly going to be captured if we stay here, she said. Is there any chance we could slip out at night? As usual, he said nothing. He knows I'll contradict him, she said tartly. I can see you're not enthusiastic about that. Her husband lifted his shoulders in an ambiguous gesture. Think of the children, Arteshib. Do you think little Lulu could do that, my dear? Could he be silent for a long time? Could he, or any of us for that matter, climb through a sewer or down the glacis in the dark? Ugnunum's face grew hot with anger at his resignation, but she had to admit to herself that what her husband said was probably true. She wasn't sure she could climb the steeply sloping scree outside the city walls, even if there were no enemy patrols making the rounds.